Hi guys, it's Dr. Hayes, and here is the video that I'm going to make, where I'm going to be talking about the Diary of Anne Frank, and also some other examples of Jewish characters in children's literature, Jewish children's literature. And so I have a couple of picture books to show and a couple novels. Not as many as the African American video, so don't worry about that. But I did want to kind of make a separate video since the other one was getting pretty long. So, we're going to continue the conversation about this double consciousness idea with the characters in children's literature who also happen to be Jewish. So, there's also that same idea of this two-ness, TWO-ness, this two-ness, this two ideas, this two identities, where you have your identity as maybe an American, or as for Anne Frank, and a Polish person, or whatever it happens to be. But you also have this Jewish identity that you are sort of having to reconcile. So you're a Jewish child, their home life may be a different experience than their classmates. When their classmates go home, but they have similar experiences when they are at school, or in the city, or participating in the community. And so there is this sort of warring of the two ideals, right? The warring of the two identities of, like, the religious Jewish nature of their lives, and then the nationality and the community that they belong to more generally. And so there is this same sort of reconciling that particular child and the child characters in the stories have to deal with, and sort of that's part of growing up for them. So you had today assigned to read some excerpts from the textbook from the Diary of Anne Frank. It's very possible that a lot of you have read that already. I know I had to read it in school. I had to read the whole thing. I don't know if you've had to read just parts of it, or you at least learned about it. But Anne Frank should be very recognizable to pretty much everybody, just knowing who she is, if you haven't actually read any of her diary. So hopefully you had a chance to read some of those excerpts and see. They were picked out, they're in chronological order, but big chunks were missing as well. So, again, like some of the stuff you've read, you don't have to worry about following the plot, but the point was to give you some snapshots of who she was. And something that I want to point out, I have the book here, Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. See, it's very thick, but you only read just a few pages in your textbook. But she starts the diary, and she names her diary Kitty. I think she names it Kitty. So sometimes it's confusing if readers don't read the first entry. They don't understand who's Kitty, who's this Kitty person. She keeps addressing her diary to Kitty. Kitty is the name she gives her diary. That's like its first name, and so she can have somebody to talk to. She can make it conversational in that way. And so she has, I don't know if you kept a diary when you were little. I kept a diary in school, and a lot of times when you write a diary, you're not really sure how to do it, so you write it almost like a letter, like, dear diary, this happened, let me tell you what happened, and then let me tell you what she said, can you believe that, like asking questions and interacting with the diary like it's a person. And so that's what she's doing, and I want to point that out because that's a very normal, like, young girl thing to do when she's writing in a diary. But the circumstance in which Anne Frank was writing this diary was anything but normal. I think the story about her that we know is very common, about how she and her family hid away in this sort of hidden annex in a house in Austria, I think is where they were. Amsterdam. Sorry, the Anne Frank house. I said Austria. That's not right. Amsterdam is where the Anne Frank house is. You can still go visit it. You can still go, and it's a museum, and you can kind of see the little rooms in the annex. I have a video, actually. I have a link to a YouTube video that gives a tour. So I will include the link to that YouTube video that gives a little tour of the annex that they were hiding out in there, and it was in Amsterdam. So you can see that. But so the circumstance in which she's writing her diary is very not normal, right? She's cooped up in there with their family. So they have to remain silent for most of the time, just so that they're, especially during business hours, because I think there was a shop or something underneath. There's only certain hours of the day when they are able to even just whisper and interact with each other, and they did that for years, where they hid out in there. And so she spent some of her, she was a teenage girl, and so she spent some of her formative years sort of in secrecy and in silence in this tiny little space in this building in Amsterdam. And but she still, because I want to make sure I point out, she still had some very normal teenage girl behaviors. She had stuff taped to the wall, like she decorated the wall by her bed, like her sleeping area. She had like little magazine pages taped up there, and there was another family. It wasn't just her family. There's another family hiding, and they had a son who Anne sort of had a crush on, and she had her first kiss. So like there's a whole part in here where she talks about having a crush on this boy, and they like somehow had some privacy, I guess, when everybody was asleep, and ended up having a first kiss in there. And so like she had all of these sort of normal teenage girl experiences that a normal teenage girl would put in her diary in a very abnormal situation. Obviously there were very abnormal situations in her diary as well, but something that a lot of people just sort of cling to in this diary and marvel at is how sort of normal teenage girly it is, even in those extreme circumstances. And so, it's this great portrait of a young girl coming of age and all the things that she encounters. It's such a far cry from My Darling, My Hamburger, right? As far as like the plight of those teenage girls and how they were growing up. But if you think about it, there's only about there's a 20-year difference, right? This is, the Holocaust was in the early 1940s, and the My Darling, My Hamburger was in the mid to late 60s is when it was set. And so there's only a 20-year difference between them, which isn't very long, as far as like we think of Anne Frank as like this sort of historical figure from the past and so culturally behind, right? But there was a lot of like my grandma was alive whenever Anne Frank was writing her diary. Just things like that are interesting to me. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. Just this sort of coming of age story of this young girl. It's just so normal. There's not really a lot of like her describing what it's like to be Jewish or what it's like to this and that, her identity. She's like talking about the cute boy who lives there with him. It's just so endearing. So I think that's why a lot of people just have clung to this. There's another thing about this Diary of Anne Frank that's sort of a misrepresentation of the situation, but it ends like the last entry I think is right before they're discovered, and they're taken to concentration camps. So if you don't look into any sort of the history of what happened to Anne Frank, if you don't look into the history of her, if you read this sort of in a vacuum and just read it as an account of the experiences of this young girl, right, then it's sort of this interesting, harrowing read of young love and a young teenager, and she has some really deep thoughts, and she has she's groping with her identity and things. It's not that unusual of a teenage girl book to read. But then, if you follow the history, it becomes very, very, very tragic. This book in and of itself, it could be a woe is me sad fest, but it isn't, right? It isn't. She wasn't, by all accounts, she wasn't just sad all the time, right? Like, there are definitely melancholy entries where she gets a little bit pensive, and she's definitely afraid for their safety, things like that. But overall, it's not a sad book. What makes it sad is the fate of the author, right? We know that we know the history, we know the fate of the author, and so that's what makes this sad, because she has all these hopes and dreams that are never realized. So to compare, I have this book I found at a used bookstore, which I was like, oh, cool, oh, cool, oh, no, when I was reading through it. So it's a picture, ooh, gosh, it was a picture book of Anne Frank, okay? Like, oh, neat. You can kind of see some of the visuals of, as she was writing. So it has, um, these sort of graphite and watercolor, colored pencil maybe, drawings of from real photographs, like her parents, her older sister. It shows about the war and how they had to go into hiding. It tells all about it, shows what she looked like, and there's some like these representations of real pictures. These aren't photographs; these are drawings of real photographs, right? So we can kind of see what she looked like, right? So this is her family, and it talks about the yellow star they had to wear to show that they were Jewish. And it just kind of takes you through the history of the Holocaust. It shows a breakdown of the annex, like the building and like the little rooms they had that were sort of hidden, and the secret entrance, and it shows you all the people who lived there. On this page, it shows you these are all the different people who lived in the annex with her, and like what all they did and got up to. And they're all kind of crammed in there, right? Here's a picture of the little bookcase that was the secret entrance to their annex and how they had to hide behind it. Let's see. It shows a picture of her sitting on her bed writing in her diary. She's got pictures posted up on her wall. She's got her little feet crossed. She's like a schoolgirl, right? She's a schoolgirl writing her diary. If you just look at this, there's absolutely nothing out of the ordinary about this girl writing in her diary and in her room with her pictures up. And let's see. And then it shows, okay, so then that's usually where it ends, right? Like, we just, she talks about, oh, this is her and the boy. This is Peter, the son of the other family, and how they sort of longed for a better life and sort of planned their future. And she had love for him, and they were in there for over 2 years together. But it's sort of, the diary itself ends like it's like a normal entry. You never know usually a young girl would never know that a diary entry is going to be her last diary entry. Like, she didn't know, this is my final entry in this diary. Like, she didn't know that. It was just a regular old entry. It wasn't really anything that spectacular. It wasn't that profound or deep, like saying goodbye. She didn't know it was goodbye. And so the picture book carries on from there. They were found in 1944 in August. August 4th, 1944, their luck ran out. That's her and Peter and all the people in hiding, and they were found. Okay, so that's usually where the diary ends. The entry it ends before that. But this picture book is horrifying that it keeps going. So it shows Anne and her family and all them being separated, men and women separated. She never sees Peter again, never any of that. And they go into the concentration camp. They go to Auschwitz, which is like this famous, one of the more famous and brutal reasons, concentration camps. They're put in these sort of uniform smocks. Their heads are shaved. It says Anne's hair was shaved off. She lost weight. But according to a woman prisoner who was also at Auschwitz and somehow survived, Anne was, quote, still lively and sweet. So her head was shaved and she lost weight, but she was still a sweet child, it says. Then in October, so they were only there for a couple months, and then her and her sister were taken to Bergen-Belsen, which is another German camp, and they both got sick with typhus because of the infected food and not good sanitation, and they died in in late February or early March of the next year, 1945. So the sister died, and then Anne died right after of typhus. Anne was 15 years old. So there's this absolutely wretchedly horrifying picture of Anne and her sister with their head shaved, gaunt, losing weight, sick with typhus, and they died. They were taken to the concentration camp in August. They died in February and March ish of the next year. So they were only there for, a few months and then got sick and died. But the tragic thing was that 2 months later, in May of 1945 is when the war ended. So you have this horrible picture of all the people celebrating the end of the war and the freeing and the emptying of the concentration camps, and they missed it by just a couple months. Right? They hid and were quiet and hid in the annex and tried to stay safe. And for over 2 years they hid like that, and then they were caught within months of the end of the war and only died because they got sick in the concentration camp. So it's just an absolutely wretchedly horrifying story. And as the story goes, Otto Frank, her dad, returned to Amsterdam, and it said this is all story, and sort of the background of her diary is kind of murky. They're not really sure, like, if it was legitimate. Some people claim it's been edited and like rewritten for like literary appeal. So some people kind of question its authenticity. The story is just that when their father Otto Frank, he survived, and so he got back to Amsterdam, and somebody had gone through the annex and had found and had kind of collected their belongings and had found Anne's diary, and he worked with the publisher and had it published in 1947, so 2 years later after she had passed and after the war ended. And it is now one of the most well-known sort of accounts of the Holocaust, like an account of a person who survived and went and endured the discrimination of Jewish people during the Holocaust. But yeah, it's not completely in question. But I just think it's interesting how our reading, this is obviously not as thorough of a text. It's a picture book intended for children. This is a full-on book. It's 2 years worth of her diary when she's 14 and 15 years old. 13, 14, 15, around in there. A young teenage girl. This is a lot more suitable for a young reader than this, if you ask me. This you're able to finish her last entry, and what a lovely account of early teenage love and young adulthood and identity formation, and you can romanticize that. This can be romanticized, right? This cannot. This does not end when the last journal entry ends. We have to read this. We have to be faced with this horrifying picture. We have to be faced with the reality, visually as well as factually, the reality of the atrocities that happened. I don't know which one is better. I don't know what my point even is, but I was just absolutely fascinated by the existence of this book and how it doesn't sugarcoat the ending. It doesn't sugarcoat the ending of her life. You can't just read her tales of a teenage girl in a vacuum and move on. Very, very fascinating stuff. Anne Frank is just probably the most famous Jewish young person that's ever existed, really. So I have a couple more. Oh, I thought I had another one over here. Did I miss it? Oh, I think I let somebody borrow it. There's a Lois Lowry book that is also Jewish American, but I don't see it. It's okay. So one that a lot of people read in school as well is Night by Elie Wiesel, and it's also about let's see, it's a teenager. It's about it's an autobiography about when he as a teenager were taken to Auschwitz in 1944. So it's an account. He's a survivor, and it's an account of his experience. But a lot of people have to read it in high school. It won the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know that it's necessarily intended for young readers. If it's not really a young reader, young adult book, but a lot of people do read it in high school. So I thought I'd mention it. I have another one called by Lois Lowry called Count the Stars, and it's about the main character is a Jewish character, and I don't see it on my shelf. I think I might have let somebody borrow it. And then there's this one I have, Catherine Lasky, The Night Journey, and this is more very similar to, if you recall in our fairy tale unit, I was telling you about Jane Yolen's excuse me, a Briar Rose, the one where it's a Sleeping Beauty tale set during the Holocaust, and it's a modern woman who is tracing the history of her grandmother and her grandmother's experience in the concentration camp. Night Journey is similar in that it's a girl who is getting told stories over the course of the novel. Her grandmother tells stories about how when her grandmother and her grandmother's family were Jewish people in Tsarist Russia, and they were having to sort of flee for their lives, and that's what the Night Journey was, where they were fleeing in secret. So these are just a couple examples. There's lots of examples of depictions of the Holocaust. What was it called? The Secret Room. Corrie ten Boom is the author, and I think it was called The Secret Room or something like that. But it was another person, Corrie ten Boom. That was her name, and she also hid in a room for a long, long, long time, and then was discovered. But she survived, and so her account is another one that I read in school. So that's one of the things I did want to mention, though. A lot of the books that are about by Jewish authors or depict Jewish characters, they're kind of like the African American books, where there's so many books about either the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery, like historical novels, or about the civil rights in the 1960s. That's kind of the choices you have, right? You have books about civil rights and segregation, or you have books about slavery and the Civil War. What we need is more books like the book about the dog Ed, who is just, it's a black family who has a silly dog, right? So the Jewish children's literature kind of suffers from the same rut, where what else are you if you're gonna write a Jewish book, you're writing it about the Holocaust, right? Like, that's what you're writing it about. So a lot of books focus on that, and focus on either the Holocaust or Hanukkah. So there's a lot of books about Hanukkah. I have a few books, like more for young readers, that I wanted to show you. Just a few. This one is called Dinosaur Goes to Israel, and it's like all about like the interesting places in Israel. And it's more like it's like a travel log, but it's definitely meant for very young kids. Right, like it's very cartoony, and it's kind of silly because this big dinosaur's riding on a plane, and he's trying to go to all these places, but it's showing like that's the Tel Aviv, airport, and they're leaving, and there's like buildings in Tel Aviv, and let's see, I'm trying to see. Oh, it talks about falafels and the food that they eat there from the street cart. They go to the beach. There's camels. So it shows that. There's Mount Masada, the Dead Sea, where you can float. Right, so there's all these places in Israel that this boy is taking his pet dinosaur on a trip. So it's kids get to learn about the cool places that are in Israel, but there's also the whimsy of having like this dinosaur experience at all. I have another one, the same publisher's PJ Library, Nona's Hanukkah Surprise. So it's a book about Hanukkah. There are so many books about Hanukkah, just because there's a lot of books about Christmas and things like that. So there are a lot of books that tell the story of the Maccabees and the menorah and Hanukkah and the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days and nights. And so this book is about this family that goes to their grandmother's house for Hanukkah and all the different things that they do. So it's very much just like a holiday book, like a Christmas book that you would find, but it's for Hanukkah instead. And this is just an example. There's lots of those like that. So if you're going to have a book that's has a Jewish emphasis, it seems like you're going to have either Hanukkah, like a holiday book, or about the Holocaust. So I'd like to see some branching out, some variety of like, oh, this is a coming of age novel set in a high school, and the character happens to be Jewish, but it's not the focus of the book. Their Jewishness is not the focus of the book. I have another one called The Very Crowded Sukkah. I don't know how you say that. I'm just gonna admit, I don't know how Sukkah? I'm not really sure. It's this thing. This little overhang thing. And it's it's also again very sort of cartoony, and they're setting it up. I'm gonna see if I could. So it's a different holiday, Sukkot, I guess you could say, and so it's a holiday that they build this thing. It looks kind of very similar to Thanksgiving. There's like corn stalks and greenery, There's pumpkins, so it's kind of a similar, like a Thanksgiving harvest type holiday. And so it's all about the family who's sort of preparing the feast. It's really cute. It's a cute book. So I just have a few examples like that to show like what sort of is available for depicting Jewish characters, and books available to Jewish children. And the other thing that I will end with is that a lot of times these books, the African American ones, the Jewish ones, a discussion we have, is who's the audience of these books, like who are they intended for, and sometimes you can go either way. It's like, oh, this is books intended to teach young Jewish children about the traditions of their holiday and the traditions and the locations of their homeland and the history of their people and with the Holocaust. You can say it's for Jewish children, but on the other hand, you can say, oh, it's also for non-Jewish readers who, maybe their parents want them to know about world religions. They want them to know about the practices of other people. Like, yes, we as a family don't celebrate Hanukkah. We, don't celebrate Sukkot, but it's interesting to know who does and how they do it, what it is. And so you might have children who are interested in it themselves. Maybe their best friend at school is Jewish, and so they want to read a book about their holiday so they can know what's happening. So there's all kinds of reasons why a reader might pick up a book like that. And I think a lot of times the authors, just depending on who they think is going to be reading their book, they might it might influence how they construct the book, what the illustrations look like, how descriptive they are with the terms they use in the book. So thinking about who the audience for these books is a recurring consideration with books for minority readers, about minority characters and by minority authors. All of those things are considerations. Okay, so that's the end of this video about Jewish children's lit. There will be other videos about Hispanic children's lit and Asian children's lit and all kinds of different things. But for now, this will be the end of this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in the chat.